On January 11th, 2026, something happened that has never occurred in the 112-year history of the Federal Reserve. The Department of Justice issued criminal subpoenas against the chairman of America's central bank. Not for corruption, according to court documents, not for fraud, not for insider trading or market manipulation, for testimony about a building renovation, testimony that Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, in his official statement, called a pretext. A pretext, he said, for something else entirely. According to Powell's own words, posted on the Federal Reserve's official website, and I quote, "The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president." Let that sink in for a moment. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, the institution that controls the value of every dollar in your pocket, every dollar in your savings account, every dollar you will ever earn, is now facing potential criminal indictment for refusing to take orders from the White House. And if you think this is just political theater, if you think this is just another Washington power struggle that does not affect your life, consider this. According to CBS News, 3 former Fed chairs and 4 former Treasury Secretaries, Republicans and Democrats alike, just issued an unprecedented joint warning. They called this, and I quote, "how monetary policy is made in emerging markets with weak institutions, with highly negative consequences for inflation and the functioning of their economies more broadly." Emerging markets with weak institutions. Former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen put it even more bluntly. She said, and I quote, "I completely disagree with that. It is the road to a banana republic." A banana republic. That is what the former chair of the Federal Reserve just called America's trajectory. Welcome to the Money Signal, where money, power, and economics collide. And nothing is ever as simple as they want you to believe. Over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what is happening to the Federal Reserve right now, using official statements, court documents, and Federal Reserve data that anyone can verify. I'm going to walk you through what happens to your money, your savings, your mortgage, your retirement, and your purchasing power when governments attack their central banks, documented by the IMF, the World Bank, and devastating case studies from Turkey, Argentina, Zimbabwe, and even America's own history in the 1970s. And I am going to show you precisely what economists from J.P. Morgan to Goldman Sachs are telling their wealthiest clients to do about it, moves that you can make too if you understand what the data is signaling. By the end, you will understand why gold just surged past $4,000 an ounce for the first time in history, why foreign governments are quietly dumping American debt at the fastest pace in decades, and what the data suggests is coming next for anyone holding dollars. Spoiler. According to Goldman Sachs research, if Fed independence is truly compromised, gold could hit $5,000 per ounce. And that is not a ceiling. According to their analysts, that is a warning signal of something much larger. To understand why this attack on the Fed matters so much to your personal finances, we need to start with what the Federal Reserve actually does and why its independence was considered sacred for over a century. According to Federal Reserve documentation, the Fed has 2 primary mandates established by Congress: maximum employment and stable prices. That is the entire job description. Keep people working and keep inflation under control. Sounds simple enough. But here's the tension that most people never consider. The fundamental conflict that makes central bank independence so critical. According to economic research from the Center for Economic Policy Research, these 2 goals often work against each other. When politicians want to win elections, they want low interest rates. Low rates mean cheap mortgages, easy car loans, credit cards with manageable payments, and businesses hiring more workers. Voters love all of that. Politicians get reelected. But according to decades of economic research, when rates stay artificially low for too long, inflation follows. It is not a theory. It is documented economic law. Prices rise, the purchasing power of your savings erodes. And by the time voters notice that their grocery bills have doubled and their rent has tripled, the politician who demanded those low rates is long gone, possibly retired on a generous pension. This is precisely why, according to IMF research spanning 100 years across 17 Latin American central banks, countries with independent central banks have consistently lower inflation than those without. The data, collected across a full century of monetary policy experiments, shows what the researchers called a strong negative association between central bank independence and inflation. Translation: independent central banks mean stable prices. Political central banks mean your savings get destroyed. Former Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, explained the mechanism this way in 2010. He said, and I quote, "Policymakers in a central bank subject to short-term political influence may face pressures to overstimulate the economy to achieve short-term output and employment gains that exceed the economy's underlying potential. Such gains may be popular at first and thus helpful in an election campaign, but they are not sustainable and soon evaporate. leaving behind only inflationary pressures. In other words, politicians will always want to juice the economy before elections. Always, regardless of party. And if they control the central bank, they will do exactly that, every single time. The historical record contains no exceptions. This is why Congress deliberately structured the Federal Reserve to be insulated from political pressure. Fed governors serve 14-year terms that span multiple administrations. The chair can only be removed for cause, not because a president disagrees with interest rate decisions. At least, that was the architecture until now. Now let me show you the numbers that explain why this administration, more than any before it, has such powerful incentive to control the Fed. According to Treasury Department data, as of January 2026, the United States currently owes $38.4 trillion in national debt. That number is so large, it has become meaningless to most people. So let me put it in terms you can feel. That debt grows by $6.12 billion every single day. That is $255 million per hour, $4.2 million per minute, $70,000 per second. While you have been watching this video, the national debt has increased by roughly $4 million. According to the Congressional Budget Office, interest payments on that debt reached $970 billion in fiscal year 2025. Let me contextualize that number. $970 billion is nearly 1/5 of every dollar collected in federal revenue, spent on nothing but interest payments. Not roads, not schools, not defense, not Social Security, just interest. According to the Joint Economic Committee, that works out to approximately $7,300 per American household per year, just to service existing debt. You are already paying that through your taxes, every year, and it is accelerating. The CBO projects those interest payments will hit $1.8 trillion by 2035, making debt service the third largest item in the entire federal budget, behind only Social Security and Medicare. According to fiscal analysts, the United States is now spending more on interest payments than on national defense, more on interest than on veterans' benefits, education, and transportation combined. Now here is where it gets dangerous, where the incentive to control the Fed becomes almost irresistible. According to Federal Reserve data, the current federal funds rate sits between 3.5 and 3.75%. President Trump, according to multiple reports from CNN, Fox Business, Al Jazeera, and ABC News, has repeatedly demanded rates at, quote, 1% and maybe lower. Think about the math for a moment. If you owe $38 trillion and you're paying 3.5% interest, you are paying roughly $1.3 trillion per year in interest. But if you could force rates down to 1%, you would only be paying $380 billion per year in interest. That is a savings of nearly $1 trillion annually. For an administration facing massive deficits, controlling the Fed is not just about politics. According to the fiscal data, it is about survival. The math is that simple and that dangerous. But according to former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, speaking at the Brookings Institution in January 2026, this creates what economists call fiscal dominance. She warned, and I quote, "When the central bank is constrained from raising rates because that would increase debt service or trigger fiscal stress, inflation expectations may become unanchored. Unanchored inflation expectations." Remember that phrase. It is the economic term for when people stop believing the government can control prices. According to every historical case study, once that happens, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. People start spending money faster because they expect it to be worth less tomorrow. That increased spending drives prices up further, which convinces more people to spend faster, which drives prices up even more. It is a doom loop, and according to the data, once it starts, it is extraordinarily difficult to stop. Now, here is where the official narrative about this investigation breaks down completely. According to Facilities Dive, CNN, and multiple news sources, the DOJ investigation is officially about a $2.5 billion Fed headquarters renovation. Powell allegedly gave misleading testimony to Congress about the project costs. Sounds like a reasonable investigation, right? Government oversight of taxpayer money? Except the timeline tells a different story. According to Powell himself, in his January 11th statement posted on the Federal Reserve's official website, and I quote, "This new threat is not about my testimony last June or about the renovation of the Federal Reserve buildings. It is not about Congress's oversight role. Those are pretexts. Powell is not hiding behind lawyers. He is not issuing carefully worded denials. He is explicitly publicly stating that the real reason for this criminal investigation is his refusal to cut interest rates on presidential command." Let me walk you through the timeline of pressure according to documented news reports, and you can judge for yourself. On April 21st, 2025, according to posts on Truth Social reported by multiple outlets, Trump called Powell a major loser and demanded immediate rate cuts. On June 30th, 2025, according to CNN reporting, Trump displayed a handwritten letter at a White House briefing, demanding ultra-low rates. He wrote that the Fed's board should be ashamed of themselves for not following his demands. On July 16th, 2025, according to reporting from multiple news organizations, Trump told House Republicans in a closed-door meeting that he would fire Powell. He showed them a draft termination letter he had prepared. On November 19th, 2025, Trump publicly stated in a press conference, and I quote, "I would love to fire his ass." On December 29th, 2025, according to Fox Business, Trump called Powell an absolute fool and threatened to sue him for incompetence. And then, January 9th, 2026, criminal subpoenas. According to ABC News, the investigation is overseen by U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro, a former Fox News host and Trump ally appointed to the position just months earlier. But the attack on the Fed extends beyond Powell personally. According to court documents and NPR reporting, the administration also attempted to remove Fed Governor Lisa Cook in August 2025. A federal judge initially blocked the firing, ruling that Cook made a strong showing that her removal violated the Federal Reserve Acts for cause protection. But the administration appealed. According to NPR, the case reached the Supreme Court on January 21st, 2026. The justices are now deciding whether the president can fire Fed governors at will, without any cause whatsoever. Here is why that case matters even more than the Powell investigation. According to legal analysts, if the Supreme Court rules that the president can remove Fed governors without cause, the same legal logic would apply to the Fed chair. Any president, current or future, could fire any Fed official who refused to follow orders on interest rates. The entire architecture of central bank independence, built over 112 years, would collapse overnight. The evidence for what happens when governments seize control of central banks is not theoretical. It is not an economic model or academic speculation. It is documented throughout history, and the results are always the same. According to economic data and news reports, Turkey provides the most relevant modern case study because we can watch it happening in real time. President Erdogan has called interest rates, and I quote, "the mother and father of all evil." He believes, contrary to all mainstream economic theory, that high interest rates cause inflation rather than cure it. Starting in 2019, according to Reuters, Erdogan systematically dismantled Turkish central bank independence. He fired central bank governors who raised rates. He appointed loyalists who cut them. The most dramatic moment came in March 2021. According to Reuters, Erdogan fired central bank governor Naci Ağbal just 2 days after Ağbal raised rates to 19% to combat 15% inflation. 2 days. The governor did exactly what economics textbooks say you should do to fight inflation. He raised rates, and he was fired within 48 hours. Ağbal was replaced with a loyalist who immediately began cutting rates, just as Erdogan wanted. The consequences, according to currency data, economic statistics, and banking sector reports, were catastrophic for the Turkish people. The Turkish lira lost 44% of its value in 2021 alone, according to exchange rate records. To put that in perspective, imagine if your bank account was worth $100,000 in January, and by December, it could only buy $56,000 worth of goods. That is what 44% currency devaluation feels like. But that was just 1 year. According to currency data, the lira has fallen from 4 lira per dollar in 2017 to 38 per dollar today. That is a 90% loss of value in less than a decade. According to Turkish government statistics, inflation peaked at 85% in 2022. 85%. That means prices nearly doubled in a single year. According to central bank data, Turkey burned through $170 billion in foreign reserves trying to defend the currency. That is, $170 billion of the Turkish people's savings gone. And according to banking sector reports, over 70% of bank deposits in Turkey are now held in dollars or euros rather than lira. The Turkish people have lost faith in their own currency. They are converting their savings to foreign money as fast as they can. That is what happens when a president controls the central bank. The people pay the price. Argentina offers another cautionary tale that spans decades, according to economic historians and IMF data. Argentina has gone through cycles of central bank politicization for generations. Presidents have repeatedly fired central bank governors, printed money to fund deficits, and imposed price controls that inevitably fail. The result, according to government statistics, was inflation reaching 143% in 2023. 143%. Prices more than doubling every year. According to UNICEF data, 55% of Argentine children now live below the poverty line. More than half the children in what was once one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America. Only when President Milei took office and allowed orthodox monetary policy did inflation begin to fall. According to central bank figures, inflation dropped to 31.5% by 2025. Still devastating by any normal standard, but the lowest in 8 years. Zimbabwe's experience was even more extreme, according to monetary history research and central bank documentation. In the 2000s, Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe ordered the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe to print money to fund government spending and land redistribution programs. The central bank complied. It had no choice. According to economic records, monthly inflation in Zimbabwe reached 79.6 billion% in November 2008. Let me repeat that number, 79.6 billion% monthly inflation. That means if something cost $1 at the beginning of November, it cost nearly $800 million by the end of November, a single month. According to central bank documentation, Zimbabwe conducted currency redenominations that removed a total of 25 zeros from the currency. 25 zeros. They eventually abandoned the Zimbabwean dollar entirely because no one would accept it. These are not ancient history. Turkey is happening right now. Argentina's crisis peaked 2 years ago. Zimbabwe collapsed within living memory. According to IMF research spanning decades across dozens of countries, the pattern is consistent and unbroken. Countries that improved central bank independence saw steady inflation declines. Countries that compromised it suffered currency crises and economic collapse. There are no exceptions in the historical record. None. The question is not whether compromising Fed independence has consequences. The historical data answers that definitively. The question is where America stands in this sequence right now. Let us run through the warning signs documented by economists using current data. According to research from the Council on Foreign Relations, the first stage of central bank compromise is public political pressure, where leaders vocally demand specific monetary policy outcomes. Current status, according to documented news reports, Trump has called Powell a fool, a loser, and an incompetent. He has publicly demanded 1% interest rates. He has threatened to fire him multiple times. Check. The second stage is attempts to remove leadership who refuse to comply. Current status, according to court documents. The administration tried to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook. The case is now before the Supreme Court. Check. The third stage is legal, prosecutorial, or legislative threats against central bank officials. Current status, according to Federal Reserve statements and DOJ documents. Criminal subpoenas have been issued against the Fed chair with threats of indictment. Check. The fourth stage is forced policy changes against economic judgment, where the central bank capitulates to political pressure. Current status, according to Federal Reserve minutes, Powell has held rates based on economic data despite White House pressure. The Fed has not yet capitulated. This stage is in active conflict. The fifth stage, according to historical patterns documented by the IMF and World Bank, is currency devaluation and inflation spiral. According to economists at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, this stage typically begins within 3 to 5 years of stage 4 completion. We are at stage 3 verging on stage 4. The markets are not waiting around to see what happens. According to precious metals data, gold surged past $4,000 per ounce for the first time in history in October 2025. The metal climbed as much as 60% during the year, breaking more than 50 record highs. According to Goldman Sachs research reports, gold could reach $5,000 per ounce or higher if Fed independence is compromised. J.P. Morgan's analysts project gold at $5,055 by the end of 2026. Morgan Stanley's Global Investment Committee stated in a recent report, and I quote, "Gold's recent rise is sending a message that the risk to Fed independence is real." Why gold? Because according to investment analysts, gold is what people buy when they lose faith in paper currencies. It is the asset of last resort, the thing that has held value for 5,000 years regardless of which governments rose or fell. When gold spikes, it means sophisticated investors, the people who manage billions of dollars, are hedging against currency collapse. Foreign central banks are making the same calculation according to Treasury International Capital data. China reduced its Treasury holdings by $25.7 billion in July 2025 alone, according to Treasury data. That brought China's total holdings to the lowest level since December 2008, nearly half what they held a decade ago. Think about what that means. China is America's largest foreign creditor, and they are selling American debt as fast as they can without crashing the market. According to the same Treasury data, overall foreign holdings of U.S. debt fell $48 billion since late March 2025. The dollar has suffered its worst first-half performance in over 50 years, according to currency index data. The dollar index dropped 10.7% through mid-2025. According to J.P. Morgan analysis, when Trump suggested firing Powell on July 16, 2025, the dollar dropped 1.2% within an hour. 1.2% does not sound like much until you realize that is roughly $50 billion in purchasing power evaporating in 60 minutes. Carl Shimada, chief market strategist at Corpay, warned in analysis, and I quote, "A prolonged erosion of confidence in the Federal Reserve's independence could weigh on the greenback, lift long-term yields, and amplify global market volatility." According to the joint statement from former Fed chairs and Treasury secretaries, these are not normal market fluctuations. They are signals that global investors are repricing American institutional stability. When the world's largest investors start treating America like an emerging market, you are already in trouble. Let me bring this home. Let me show you exactly what this means for your money, according to current financial data and historical patterns. According to Freddie Mac, the average 30-year mortgage rate sits at 6.06% as of January 2026, down from 7.04% a year ago. Here's the math on what rates mean for a typical home purchase. Financing a $500,000 home at 2021's record low rate of 2.93% meant monthly payments of $2,089. At current 6% rates, according to mortgage calculators, that same mortgage costs $3,088 monthly. That is a 48% increase, or nearly $12,000 more per year, just for the same house. Now consider what happens if Fed independence is compromised and long-term rates rise due to inflation fears. According to historical data, when investors lose faith in a central bank's ability to control inflation, they demand higher interest rates on long-term bonds as compensation for the risk. Mortgage rates are tied to those long-term bond rates. If mortgage rates hit 8%, that $500,000 house costs $3,669 per month. If they hit 10%, monthly payments reach $4,387. According to LendingTree data, the average credit card APR for new cards is already 23.79%. Americans carry $1.233 trillion in credit card debt. If inflation spikes and the Fed is prevented from responding, according to economic research, credit card rates would climb even higher as banks price in inflation risk. Rates above 30% would not be unusual based on historical precedent. According to Fortune, top high-yield savings accounts currently pay between 4 and 5% APY, directly tracking Fed rates. But here is what most people do not understand about inflation and savings. If your savings account pays 5%, but inflation is running at 10%, you are losing 5% of your purchasing power every year, even while your balance grows. According to calculations from the Daily Economy, a 10% inflation rate destroys purchasing power rapidly. A $50,000 salary loses $5,000 in purchasing power annually. That is not just a number on paper. That is a month's rent, a year of groceries, your child's college savings evaporating. Academic research from the Center for Economic Policy Research quantifies the risk with mathematical precision. A political pressure shock lasting 6 months at half the level Nixon applied to the Fed in the 1970s would raise the U.S. price level by more than 8%. According to Yellen's remarks at Brookings, the Nixon precedent is exactly what we should fear. President Nixon pressured Fed Chair Arthur Burns to keep rates low before the 1972 election. Burns, unlike Powell, complied. The result was the Great Inflation, a decade of stagflation that devastated American households. According to economic data, inflation averaged over 7% through the 1970s and peaked above 14% in 1980. Unemployment and inflation rose simultaneously, something economists had thought impossible. It took Fed Chair Paul Volcker raising rates to 20% in the early 1980s, triggering the worst recession since the Great Depression, to finally break the inflation cycle. According to economic historians, that is what it costs to fix the damage once inflation expectations become unanchored. Years of pain, millions of jobs lost, a generation's savings destroyed. The parallels to today, according to those same historians, are striking. I want to leave you with the words of the people who understand this best, the former Fed chairs and Treasury secretaries who have spent their careers managing American monetary policy. According to CBS News, Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, Robert Rubin, Larry Summers, Tim Geithner, and Jack Lew, spanning administrations from Reagan to Biden, issued this joint statement. And I quote, "The reported criminal inquiry into Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell is an unprecedented attempt to use prosecutorial attacks to undermine that independence. This is how monetary policy is made in emerging markets with weak institutions, with highly negative consequences for inflation and the functioning of their economies more broadly. It has no place in the United States." Yellen, speaking separately on CNBC, said, and I quote, "Knowing Powell as well as I do, the odds that he would have lied are zero. I believe they are going after him because they want his seat and want him gone." Republican Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina stated, according to PBS, and I quote, "If there were any remaining doubt whether advisors within the Trump administration are actively pushing to end the independence of the Federal Reserve, there should now be none." Tillis vowed to oppose any Trump-Fed nominee until the matter is resolved. This is not a partisan issue anymore. According to the statements and data, both Republican and Democratic economists, politicians, and former officials agree that central bank independence is fundamental to economic stability. The historical record offers no examples of governments successfully controlling their central banks without triggering inflation and currency collapse. Zero. Turkey's inflation only fell after Erdogan finally, reluctantly allowed 50% interest rates. Argentina's inflation dropped only when Milei permitted orthodox monetary policy. Weimar Germany's hyperinflation ended only when the Reichsbank stopped financing government spending. America's great inflation of the 1970s ended only when Volcker raised rates to 20%, crushing the economy to save the currency. According to IMF research spanning decades across dozens of countries, the conclusion is unambiguous. Central bank independence matters for price stability, and price stability matters for consistent long-term growth. Powell himself stated in his January 11th response, and I quote, "I will continue to do this job with integrity and a commitment to serving the American people." According to current data, he is holding the line. But for how long, and at what cost? According to Federal Reserve projections, if independence is maintained, inflation should stabilize toward the 2% target by 2027. Mortgage rates could decline further. Savings accounts will continue earning competitive returns. The dollar will remain the world's reserve currency. But according to historical patterns from Turkey, Argentina, Zimbabwe, and America's own 1970s, if independence is compromised, the forecast changes dramatically. Rising inflation, eroding purchasing power. A weakening dollar increasing the cost of everything imported, which in a global economy means almost everything. Long-term interest rates climbing despite Fed cuts as investors demand compensation for inflation risk. Gold potentially surging past $5,000 as investors flee dollar-denominated assets for something that cannot be printed on command. The joint statement from former Fed chairs and Treasury Secretaries serves as both warning and call to action. Maintaining Fed independence, they wrote, is not just good policy. It is the foundation that keeps your grocery bill stable and your savings secure. History does not repeat. But according to the data, it warns. The signal has been there for years in gold prices and currency movements, in the quiet exodus of foreign central banks from American debt. According to all those indicators, the signal is getting louder. Most people are not listening. Now you are. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I will show you where to look.